History has a hidden side, and prophecy is the key that unlocks it. We are continuing our deep dive into one of the most significant mysteries of the Bible, the prophetic significance of Joseph's descendants, Ephraim and Manasseh. We aren't just looking at ancient text, we are tying the word to the historical timeline. As we dive even deeper into their story, we are beginning to clearly reveal who reflects the hidden identity of Joseph's descendants today, and exactly where they can be found in our modern world. We are leaving no stone unturned. From the biblical timeline to present day reality, we identify the key figures who have walked out the prophetic pattern of Ephraim and Manasseh in our own time. This story is unfolding, and you don't want any gaps in biblical prophecy. If you're new, go back to the beginning and catch up on previous episodes. Join the conversation live every Saturday morning. Visit our Facebook page, DIY Media Ministry, to find out how. To catch up on previous episodes, be sure and subscribe and click the notification button at www.joesandjews.com. We want your questions and your comments. If you can't make it live, leave your questions right here in the comments. We'll address them in our upcoming session. The journey continues. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Welcome to our platform. We are still in not just the P's of Joseph, but now the P's of Ephraim and Manasseh, continuing our study. Pray everyone had a blessed week. We've just finished the Feast of Purim this week, and looking forward to hearing what the Lord has to share with us as we move forward in our day. So let's go before the Lord in prayer, praising Him, for He is good, and He is faithful, He is just, and He is true. In the midst of all of the things that are taking place in the world, we know that we have a rock that we can depend on, who's not moved by the events that are happening in the world. And so we just give praise and glory to our Father, the only one true and wise King. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. And so the next voice you will hear is that of Charlie McLaughlin.
Shabbat Shalom to everyone. That is Sabbath peace. Hope everyone had a great weekend. We are back with you. This time we are coming to you remote. We're not at home on the home front today, so we may have a little difficulty. I don't know. We hope we get through this without any issues. We are continuing our study on Joseph's 7 P's, but this round we're going through to see prophetically those P's, how they apply. Each word applies to Joseph's descendants, particularly Ephraim, but Ephraim and Manasseh both experienced, but Ephraim primarily will experience the P's fully as Joseph did. So, as we continue our study, we have already begun to look at Ephraim. We looked at Genesis chapter 37, and we saw that Ephraim has had an issue. Ephraim, if you understand, he became the first king of the northern kingdom, named Jeroboam. who was descended from Joseph's youngest son, Ephraim. And so when we look into the scripture, we find that Ephraim had some issues. One of the names of the northern kingdom of Israel is they were called the northern kingdom of Israel, because they inherited the name, Genesis 48, verse, the chapter there, where Jacob placed his hands on Joseph's sons and passed the birthright blessing to Joseph. So what we have is that Ephraim descendant Jeroboam did not continue. He did not continue with the Lord as he should have. And we have this given to us in as a side, well, not a side, but a scripture where we go to 1 Kings, and we see in 1 Kings chapter 12. Let's go to chapter 12. Actually, it starts in chapter 11, where Solomon has departed from the Lord and gotten off into idolatry. And God let Solomon know. We page down so we can have it on the screen. Where's the page down? Okay, here it is. And the Lord raises up adversaries against Solomon, starting around 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 9. And one of the adversaries ends up being Jeroboam. And the reason Jeroboam becomes an adversary of Solomon is that Solomon had used him, and we could find that in 1 Kings chapter 11 at verse 26. If you're making a note, you can write that down because it gives you some of the background. And you can back up and see that before this, well, actually, it's what verse did I say? It's verse 26. Yeah, and Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephrathite. Ephrathite is another word of saying Ephraim. He's of the tribe of Ephraim. And Ephraim's tribe was descended from Joseph's youngest son. So he's an Ephrathite of Zeradah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow woman. Even he lifted up his hand against the king. And now it tells us, the rest of the verse tells us why this happened. And so we go on in verse 27, it says, and this was the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king, Solomon. Solomon built Millo and repaired the breaches of the city of David his father. And the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor. And Solomon, seeing the young man that he was industrious, he made him ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph. Now, we want to pause right there. Understand here that even though at this point the kingdom had not split into two kingdoms and two nations, they had always been understood that there was a house of Joseph and then there was a house of Judah. When they began to see this is where back in Genesis, when Jacob works for Laban to get his wives, Rachel and Leah. He made a covenant with his father-in-law to marry Rachel. However, after working 7 years, as they had agreed, he did not get Rachel. He gave him Leah. And he had deceived him. He tricked him. So he had to work another 7 years in order to get Rachel, the bride that he actually desired and had agreed to originally. Well, to make a longer story short, he continues to work not only those 14 years to get the two wives, but he continues to work for another 6 years. Supposed to be 7, but 6 more years he works. And after Joseph is born, and he's continued to do this work, and things are going well. Laban is getting blessed, but they make an agreement that so certain of the livestock could be Jacob's, certain colors, and certain colors would be Laban's. And Jacob ends up getting most of the livestock of his father-in-law, becomes his. And so they're not really happy with him. And so after 6 years, again, during this time that we're talking about, all but one of Jacob's children are born. All but Benjamin. They're all born while Jacob is working for Laban, his father-in-law. So when they leave, they end up sneaking out of the land, and he chases him. His father-in-law chases him down, but God intervenes and tells him not to say one word to him, bad, good or bad. And so he ends up letting him go. And on his way back to Canaan, as Jacob and his family are going back, in I think it's Genesis chapter 32, you will see in verse 7 and verse 10 that Jacob is, as he's anticipating meeting his brother, his twin brother Esau, he's afraid, and so he's going to separate his family based upon his two wives and their respective companions, their respective handmaids, because he has children by not only the wives Leah and Rachel, but he also has children by their handmaids, each of them having a handmaid, Zilpah and Bilhah. Mm-hmm. And so what he does when he thinks he's going to encounter Esau, he puts the ones that he's least concerned about, we put it that way, out front. And he puts his favorite wife, the one he's most concerned about, with her child. She's had only one at this point, Joseph, close to him, so that if part of them get attacked, part of them might get away. So if one half gets attacked, the other half may survive. So he does this. And when you read here in Genesis chapter 32, verse 7, it says that then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that was with him, and the flocks and herds, and the camels into 2 bands. Notice the phrase there, 2 bands. That word band, machane, is actually comes from the root word that means grace, favor, and it's also translated as a camp or band. As here it's translated as band. And the reason being because a machane, a camp, a band, why is it comes from the root word grace, is that generally when they made a form out in the wilderness into a camp, they would set themselves up in a way that they would be able to defend themselves. And you will see this in the Westerns. If you look at any of the Westerns where it talks about the wagon trains and all, you say when they were anticipating an attack, they would put the wagon trains in a circle, in a camp, so that the camp, could be protected from those who would attack. And so this is what Jacob's plan is. And so the basic root word for favor speaks of protection, being favored to win, in case of an attack. So you camp. When camping in the wilderness, you would always arrange yourself in such a way that you could survive an attack. So your conditions would be favorable, gracious, in other words. So the root word for favor, I give you a song that actually reveals the meaning of the root word khan, which means favor. It's a picture of a fence or wall, and then it's a second character. The root is two characters, and then a seed sprout. The seed just starting to sprout, usually drawn out like it looks like a little comma with a wiggly tail on it, indicating a seed just starting to sprout. So it means the fence seed. So if you've ever heard the song, Jesus be a fence all around me every day, that song actually describes the Hebrew word that depicts the fenced seed protected by God. It's the word grace in the New Covenant, or favor. So he puts them in two bands, and so you see it in verse 7, and then he mentions it again in verse 10 when he's praying to the Lord, and he says, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become two bands. That's describing the basics for the two houses of Israel was based upon the two wives, each wife having their respective companion who also had children for Jacob. Again, you will see this in Ezekiel 37 when it talks about the two sticks. It's talking about this very same thing here. A stick for Joseph in Ephraim's hand, and then a stick for Judah. And the two sticks are to become one. We are right now prophetically in the times where God will be bringing the two sticks together as one, Ephraim and Judah, Israel and the Jews. Remember, they are not the same. Jews speak of Judah. Israel, the house of Israel, speaks of the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom was the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay, so with that said, we go back to Kings, and we see that Solomon, where it was giving us the reason that Jeroboam ends up becoming an adversary to Solomon. Number one, the conditions that this is happening under is Solomon is off into serious idolatry. So if you read the verses before, I think even back up to verse 1, just go back up. You're on the column there now. And we're coming back down to that verse, okay. Yeah, starting at verse 1 of chapter 11, it tells us how Solomon turns from the Lord and gets off into serious idolatry from verses 1 through 8. So when we go back down where we were, in where it's giving us the reason that Jeroboam ends up being an adversary to Solomon, it says that Solomon put him over the house of Joseph. That's where we stepped off before we went to see why Joseph is being distinguished as a house. So the 10 northern tribes basically included were based on Joseph's descendants. They followed Joseph's descendants. Ephraim and Manasseh were leading tribes amongst the children of Israel. Not only at this time do you have the house of Joseph being 10 tribes, but it's actually 11. Benjamin is part of the house of Joseph. He's Joseph's brother by the same mother. So it's important to note this also. This is all taking place when Solomon is into his idolatry. So it tells us in verse 29, and it came to pass that at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah, this is very important right here, verse 29, that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, he was from Shiloh, or we call it Shiloh. Shiloh is where the capital was located first before the ark came into Jerusalem under David's administration. Joshua ended up with the camp being at Shiloh, and that's where it remained for over 360 some years, a long time, several centuries plus. And so the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him in the way while he went out of Jerusalem. Of course, the capital is at Jerusalem at this time, because this is Solomon's reign, and David God moved it there. And if you read Psalm 78, you will read, I think it's there where you'll read the story of how it said that God rejected the tabernacle of Joseph. Mm-hmm. But then he's going to give mercy to the house of David, the tabernacle of David. And so, as you look here, it said that this prophet, Ahijah, found him in the way, on his way out of Jerusalem, and he had clad himself with a new garment. So Jeroboam has on this new garment, and they too were alone in the field. And so what does this prophet do? Look at verse 30. And Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him and rent it in 12 pieces. He tears it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, thus saith Jehovah, the Lord is in all caps, God's name's there, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend, that is to tear, rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to thee. So understand, this is being done by God. But he shall have, he's speaking of Solomon, but he shall have one tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. Now, one tribe here is speaking of in addition to himself. Judah, David's own tribe is Judah, but he's going to give him one tribe, and that tribe is going to be Benjamin. So if you go ahead and read on, you find out that Solomon, when he realizes this, page down, and we see that Solomon is going to chase him down. Okay, he's going to seek to kill Jeroboam. And so he says in the prophets, he goes on to say, howbeit, verse 34, we read there, howbeit I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life for David, my servant's sake, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes. So he's saying why he's not going to take everything from Rehoboam, which is Solomon's son. But he says, verse 35, but I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and will give it unto thee, even 10 tribes. And unto his son will I give one tribe, that David my servant may have a light always before me in Jerusalem. Remember, Yeshua, the descendant of David, is going to have to show up in Jerusalem, this city which I have chosen me to put my name there. And I will take thee, and thou shalt reign according to all that thy soul desireth, and shall be king, here it is, verse 37, shall be king over Israel. So you speak of Judah, you speak of Solomon's son, the southern kingdom. You speak of northern kingdom, you speak of Israel, because Joseph inherited the birthright. First Chronicles chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Now, going on, he says here, and it shall be if, notice the promise, and it shall be, verse 38, 1 Kings 11, and it shall be if thou wilt hearken unto all that I command thee, and will walk in my ways, and do that is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments as David my servant did, that I will be with thee and build thee a sure house as I built for David, and will give Israel unto thee. And I will for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever. Because of what Solomon did, the seed of David would be afflicted. And you also got, because of one thing that David did wrong when he got with Bathsheba, committed adultery. God prophesied that there would be problems in his household, but he received the sure mercies of God because of his repentance. But it would not keep him from having family troubles. And we see quite a few showed up even while David was still living. Okay, but going on, notice verse 40 says, Solomon sought therefore, for what reason? Because Solomon's aware that Jeroboam is going to be his replacement in terms of most of the kingdom. And he's only going to leave one tribe with Judah. So it'll be two tribes with Judah, and then it's going to be Benjamin. And so he sought to kill Jeroboam. And look what happened. Jeroboam, we're not going to read the whole entirety of this, because we wanted to get some background here on where we get two houses. When you deal with the prodigal son story, you're dealing with the older brother who's going to be at home, prophetically at home in the end time, but Joseph is still going to be, Judah is going to be at home, but the house of Joseph, the house of Israel, the house of, that is of Ephraim, the 10 tribes, will still be dispersed, along with some of Judah. And you could even say even Benjamin, but not mostly Benjamin, because Benjamin's tribe was protected because Benjamin's inheritance, Jerusalem was in Benjamin's inheritance. Even though it was the capital, it was built in Benjamin's inheritance. Now, so we have that Solomon seeks to kill him. He goes off to Egypt, and there are others that end up coming up against Solomon as adversaries, and they also are off in Egypt. And one of them actually is going to end up taking his people when he leaves Egypt. Another one that's an adversary to Solomon is going to end up going to Damascus. That's where that Syria, modern day Syria. We're not going to get into those details. So what we look up here, we're going to, if you look up for the Ephraim as it relates to pride, if you search in the scripture Ephraim and the word pride show up, we find that the northern kingdom, because when Jeroboam, you read in the next chapter, this happens. Rehoboam is going to make the yoke and the burden heavy on Israel when he becomes king. When they had asked him to give them relief, because his father Solomon was very hard on them, made them work, used them like slaves, and actually he made Jeroboam like the chief over them. He made them like a foreman over the 10 tribes. So there was some tension between the house of David and the 10 tribes of Judah. Now, Benjamin didn't get caught up in this as much because Benjamin, again, his inheritance, Jerusalem was in his inheritance. So you can think he's a little more privileged to be living in the capital region, because that's the region of his inheritance. It was more than just Jerusalem, which was Jebus. If you go back when the land was allotted, Jebus was given to Benjamin. Jebus becomes Jerusalem. Okay, so as we go on, we say if you search, you'll see that the Bible, during the course of the kings, Jeroboam was promised the same thing the blessings that David had. And we wanted to read that God is the one. So this didn't happen because of rebellion. It came about, there was a revolt against Rehoboam when he decided to chastise them with whips. He said, well, Solomon did it one way, he's going to do it with whips. He's going to do it with scorpions. He's going to make their work and labor more burdensome. Their yoke was going to be much heavier. And so they left him. They left Rehoboam. You see this all transpiring in chapter 12. And so when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, is preparing to go after the northern kingdom to fight them, to bring them back under his rule, God intervenes and tells them that to leave them alone, says that this separation is of him. So it's very important to know the background. God tells them, don't mess with the northern kingdom, Israel, the house of Joseph, which is under Jeroboam, Ephraim's descendant. Joseph's descendant through Ephraim. Okay, so if you want to write these verses down, we said the P's of Ephraim. If you'll note, we already have gotten into some of them, but here's for some background. If you write down Isaiah 9:9, where it says, and all the people shall know, even Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, that say in the pride and stoutness of their heart. They're talking about what they're going to do, even though God is judging them, how they're going to rebuild. And you write that down, you can read verse 9 and verse 10, because it's also prophetic too, to even that verse. Then you look at Isaiah 28 verse 1. God says, woe. Watch out when God says woe. It's not good for people when God says woe. Woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. Again, he's speaking of the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, Jeroboam, refused to go up to Jerusalem out of fear to celebrate God's worship time, his appointed time. We call the feast. He refused to go up to Jerusalem the 3 times that they were required. He decided to put a golden calf in Bethel and in Dan and to say, this is your God. So he makes the same mistake. But God had promised him that he would treat him just like he did David in terms of the mercy and the blessings. But out of fear, he changes the worship of God. And it affects the whole northern kingdom, from Bethel to Dan. And so, in pride, one thing about selfishness, it manifests 2 ways. First, it may show up as fear, because it's self-concern. Often when one thinks of oneself, timidity, as one thinks of oneself lower than they should, it shows up as timidity or fear. But when one thinks of themselves more than they ought to, above that they should, it comes out as pride. But both of them focus on selfishness, self-centeredness. That's why love casts out fear. When you're concerned about others outside of self, you will not be in fear. A woman who may be terrified of heights or run into a burning house to get her child out. And if she comes out with him, she'll faint then, baby. Same thing with a father. When we act in love, fear falls to the side. Okay, but the other opposite end of selfishness is pride. So you have timidity, fear on one end, and pride on the other end. And so pride becomes the issue of Ephraim, because they're not doing things God's way, they're doing it their own way. They kick all the Levites, all of the priests that God ordained. Only the sons of Aaron could be priests, and only the Levites could serve alongside the priests in the priesthood, not receiving inheritance. That's why they weren't counted as amongst the 12. But he kicks all of the priests out of the northern kingdom. And he ends up appointing whoever base persons wanted to become a priest. They could do it if they had the right offering, or they could pay. So it was like it is today. A lot of people decide they want it because they want the social prestige, the power, the influence of being a leader in the quote church. And when that happens, you end up people they're in these positions that are not called. They're not called by God. They go get a degree. They have other means. They treat it like it's a secular profession. I'm old enough to remember when their focal point was on man had to have an anointing, be called by God, and there was an anointing. When he preached, you knew God was present. Now the guy just emphasized a degree. So Ephraim has become just like Ephraim was then. So we're talking about modern day Ephraim where we live. But notice the other verses that were Isaiah 28:3, the crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, repeated again, shall be trodden under feet. Hosea chapter 5, verse 5. And the pride of Israel doth testify to his face. Therefore shall Israel and Ephraim fall in their iniquity. Judah also shall fall with them. But what he promised back in chapter 1 of Hosea was that Judah would be getting mercy, where Ephraim, or the house of Israel, would not receive mercy. So with that background, we have pride. The P, Ephraim ends up getting carried away in 2 Kings chapter 17 into captivity under the Assyrians. And a large part of Judah. If you read in chapter 18, you'll read that all the fenced cities of Judah was taken as well. This is during Hezekiah's reign. And it started before Hezekiah, but when he went after Samaria fell, and that was around 721 or 722. It took several years for them to conquer the northern kingdom totally, and when they took Samaria, the capital, then the Assyrian king replaced most of the tribes of Israel, replaced them with people from other countries. Matter of fact, modern day Iran was one of the places that he took people from to repopulate the land. There was still a remnant of Ephraim there, but now most of them were people that had been replanted by the king. And some of them had also been taken away to Iran, among other places that are named in 2 Kings chapter 17. So I'll give you that as a reference to see where they were taken. It doesn't tell you where everybody went, though. Got to remember, Ephraim and Manasseh, or Manasseh the oldest and Ephraim the younger of Joseph's son, those two tribes, remember, these two guys were born in Egypt, raised in Egypt, lived their life in Egypt. They were Egyptians, even though they were by birth descendants of Abraham through Jacob, through Joseph. They lived in the most powerful nation on the planet at the time because of the blessings that came from God through Joseph's ministry. These are his sons. And so they prospered and had prominent places in the land of Egypt. And so you'll find that in the P's of Ephraim, as we go through these, we see that Ephraim will track with Joseph in terms of each P. And so we see pride is mentioned. Pride so stout that they're going to end up being divorced by God. He gives them a bill of divorcement. I think we gave the scripture on that while earlier in the previous study on going through this. And so they're going to end up going back into Egypt by ship. Mm-hmm. But Egypt, not necessarily Egypt, the nation, but Egypt in terms of what Egypt represents. If you go back to the 10 Commandments in verse 2 of chapter 20, the 10 words, the first word is what God, by name, introduces himself as the one who brought the whole nation out of the land of Egypt. And then he references it, calls it the house of bondage. So Egypt was a symbolic of the house of bondage. So when we got to Deuteronomy 28, verse 68, the last of the curses, you had the blessings, verses 1 through 14, but then verses 15 to 28, you had the curses that would come on God's people if they did not keep his word. They did not keep his commandments. They did not love him. Because Yeshua said, if we love him, we would keep his commandments. He's the one who spoke those commandments. And so the last one was that they would go back into Egypt by ship. And so we got the pit. So from pride to the pit, in which there was no water, we see that Ephraim slavery would be like Joseph's, would have intermediate between pride and becoming a slave was the way we get there. The pit. The pit is the jump off, the departure, the separation point. It's where the coat of many colors come off of Joseph. Because of the hatred of his brothers, he's now going to end up in slavery, taken from the pit in which there was no water. His descendants in the transatlantic slave trade, and not only that one, but even in the eastern slave trade, but that main one is the transatlantic that's going to focus on Ephraim. They're in the pit of the ship, shipped to Brazil, to the Caribbean, and to North America. The vast majority are shipped to Brazil. And many of them die there under the harsh, difficult work conditions for slaves. The Portuguese were major players in that. They were in the slave trade before Britain got involved. And they were the most dominant slavers, enslaving people from Africa. Now you say, why Africa? Because this is where many of Joseph's descendants end up. And they found many of them to this day. They're still looking for the people from Israel. We have met personally people that were from Israel, Judah, Jews looking for the lost tribes in Africa. We happened to be in one country there, not knowing they were going to be there filming and doing a documentary, but we were there when they showed up in the country we visited in East Africa. I won't go into details on that right now because this is going online and don't want to put people in any kind of dangerous position, though. But multiple nations throughout Africa know that have Jews there are Israelites. And many of them identifying as Judah because that's the only way Israel is accepting anybody back, because the modern nation of Israel is supposed to be, by decree, going back to the United Nations in their resolution in 1947, it's supposed to be a Jewish state and an Arab state. That's the deal, as a democracy. That's the mistake they made. They submitted to becoming a democracy and not being a theocracy. Under democracy, there's no place for God. God does not have a place. His law does not have a place. It's just what people say. Even the U.S., we don't have a democratic form of government. You read the Constitution, it guarantees us a Republican form of government. Now understand, this had nothing to do with the Republican Party. The party didn't even exist when this was done. The party didn't even exist until they were trying to get rid of slavery. And many of the Democrats that were against slavery end up, along with the Whig Party and others that were anti-slavery, against slavery, they end up forming a new party. But this was before that. And you have to understand what it meant. It was become a nation not based upon just what people rule and decide to do, but a nation based upon the laws of God. Going back to the Declaration of Independence, that rights don't come from government. So they didn't want a king. They wanted God to be acknowledged, and they did acknowledge God, the Creator, as the giver of rights. They have not always stayed true to that creed, but because the nation was founded upon that premise, God honored those who honored him. And those righteous leaders, those who were righteous, they laid a foundation that put God in place. And that's why this nation has endured for so long. So, God is not going to be cut out of the picture. And our education system is a godless education system that says, in the theory of evolution, that God does not exist, that ultimately man must be God and save himself. That is official doctrine, too. If you ever read the Humanist Manifesto, official document that is the basis of the public education system in the U.S. and now in the world, because that model has been spread around the world. It's based on a Greco-Roman educational system, going back to Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. These guys, they are foundational to the university systems that we have in the world that are called the best in the world, so-called. Now, that being said, where we were back here, we were looking at what happened with Ephraim. And Ephraim is transported in ships, which are associated with water. So he's in the pit. They're in the pit of the ships in which there is no water. There were 7 basic nations, major nations, that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And I don't have the list. I didn't bring it down with me, but you had the Dutch, you had the Portuguese, the Portuguese. They were the number 1 contributor to the slave trade before Britain got involved, and even after they got out of it. The Portuguese were still involved in slavery, the slave trade. Spain, majorly, had a big involvement with the slave trade. And you go on down the list. You have France was involved. You have Britain gets involved later, and then you have the United States. You have the Netherlands. That's like 6 of them. I think I'm missing one. But these were the major ones by volume in the slave trade. And there were others that were involved. Even Italy, they were involved in business from a business standpoint. The cities of Italy, where a lot of the financiers, they provided the insurance and the capital for the slave trade. So they were major investors. That being said, what are we doing? We move on from the pit of the ship, in which there was no water, where Ephraim ends up being transported. Where does Ephraim thrive? Ephraim thrives. Now, what we focus on, while it was the Dutch that began, even as early as the 1400s, began being involved in the slave trade, primarily big time in the 1500s, is that when did Europe, not Europe in general, but when did Britain get involved? When they got involved is where we find, as we discussed on last week, the island of Bermuda, the British colony. Became a colony in 1612. It became recognized as a British possession, or with the shipwreck of 1609, where John Roloff was on that ship, and the one who would later become, when they become a colony, become the major company that was involved with the slave trade. I can't remember him by name right now, but he the charter went from the Virginia company to this particular man. He was on that ship when it shipwrecked. They were there for 10 months there in 1609, and then they built another ship, Providence and Patience, to go on to Virginia, because there were fleet of ships, and this was the one that crashed. John Roloff, who was crashed there, also became noted for marrying Pocahontas. His wife died. She didn't survive after that shipwreck. But we noted last week that this is how they are identified based upon Luke. The lost coin became the minted coin as early as the first time, when the year when the first enslaved men were brought there. The 2 that came in August of 1616 on a ship named the Edwin, 1616. One of them's name shows up in a record in 1617. So some try to use 17 as the date when it started, but no, that was when the name showed up in record. But one was a Native American from the Caribbean, and the other one was an African, an Ephraimite who was in Africa. And say, how do we know it's happened? Because the scripture prophesied that this was going to happen. And so where do we get a connection with scripture? Is that island possibly in the same year. The records, when you search the hog money, was currency that was circulated. It was probably the first money circulated under British colonial, in the British colonies, and started at Bermuda. And it was used. Bermuda began to thrive. They were brought there to die for pearls, but there were no pearls. So in there, notice here, remember the lost, the pearl of great price, the parable of a pearl hidden in the field. So pearls was the thing that got them there. Those two enslaved men were brought there by the governor, who sent that ship Edwin after them, brought them back in August to search, to dive for pearls, but no pearls were to be found, so they ended up putting them in the fields doing agricultural work. And then the years following, numerous Africans were brought, as well as Native Americans, were brought to the island of Bermuda. And so this was in 1616. 3 years before Jamestown brought any slaves to Virginia. But our history book starts it at 1619. But it was actually 1616, the first arrival. And so you have the connection with the pearl. You have connection with the coin that they minted, and it was probably printed somewhere in Britain, where it was minted for the colony of Bermuda. And it's got its name from a Spanish explorer. Remember that. They brought a lot of hogs there previously, but they didn't inhabit the place. It was basically where people were there temporarily, shipwrecked and stuff like of that nature. But their hogs proliferated. They multiplied on that island so significantly that it became this symbol for that colony. And they put it on the coin. So on the coin, the hog currency, and you can go look it up online, the hog currency. Tori will probably have some information on it online where you can references where you can see some of it. To this day, it goes for, like, if we found one, it may go for as much as $80,000, one coin. Cheap coin, but very valuable. Has a Spanish hog on one side and a ship on the other side. So what? We're going by ship. The prodigal son, when he comes to his senses, what he's going to be doing? He's going to be working, feeding the hogs, wishing he could just eat some of the food that the hogs are eating. So this is where you find the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, beginning the 400-year count that was prophesied in Genesis chapter 15. When you go to Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, where God told Abraham, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation, this is verse 14, notice, nation singular, one nation, whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. Now, we've already established without doubt, if you base on Scripture, this could not have been Egypt. Number one, Egypt from the river Nile all the way into the Euphrates over in the region of Iran, Iraq, was given to Abraham. As a matter of fact, you only have to go down a few verses down to see where he said that he gave to Abraham. But so it's a land not their own. But in this very context, the last verses of this chapter tell you what is given to Abraham. Okay, so from the river of Egypt to the river of Egypt, it speaks of the Nile, to the great river Euphrates. So we've already established that from Joseph's death until the Exodus was 144 years, when Moses was 80 years old. From Joseph's death to Moses' birth was 64 years. 64 was a prophetic number also that will point to, in the end time, to who Ephraim is. And so what do we have? We have Ephraim being sold out of the pit, auctioned off to Potiphar's in the transatlantic slave trade. And those who are brought to Bermuda first, and then Virginia, and then throughout the colonial, the British colonies. Now, while we are tying this to the British colonies, remember who it was that said, amongst the brothers, that said, when Joseph was, while he was in the pit, said that we need to sell him. Said that we need to sell him. We don't need to kill him. We need to sell him. Back in Genesis 37, it was Judah. Judah was the one who said, sell Joseph to slavery, into slavery. So when we look, why we're not looking at the Portuguese or the other nations of Europe, why are we looking at Britain? Because Britain has a direct connection to Judah. We're not dealing with Judah's story right now. We may need to go in and get into it after we do Joseph. The 7 P's, we look at Judah's story because it's going to track along with Joseph in many ways, because David never ceases to have his descendants reigning over Israel. He didn't say over Judah, he said Israel, but they were united under David. But when they split, the name went with the northern kingdom. And there's not been a descendant of David reigning in the promised land since Zedekiah, under the Babylonian captivity of Nebuchadnezzar. But God said there would be an unbroken reign of David's descendants, and we'll get into that. And so that's why it's Britain Britain is key to understanding where Ephraim becomes slave. It's Judah that's going to get involved, and this is the only place where you'll find they prosper. Slaves in Brazil, they were dying. The only way they could keep the slave trade going in Brazil, they had to keep recruiting new slaves because so many of them dying off under the harsh conditions, along with that Native American slaves. The natives was enslaved as well. Many of the slaves were taken. Natives were taken from the continental U.S. to the Caribbean, so they couldn't escape and go back home. And they would often bargain and trade the native slaves for the African slaves on the continent to put the natives out on the Caribbean. So these are things that went on during the slave trade. But why is Britain involved in the colonies? The focal point of Ephraim is because in the history with Britain, we will find. Matter of fact, if I just go straight to the chase, as you say, go straight to the point. If you pull up and look up King Charles's genealogy, his genealogy goes back to David, his written record, the written record of him, his mother, and you trace it back. It goes back to King David and back to the time of Babylon, when Nebuchadnezzar was taking over Babylon. And you remember Zedekiah had daughters. They killed his Zedekiah's sons right in front of him before they poked his eyes out. The last thing he saw was his sons being executed. He had daughters. Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah mentions them. And there's a history concerning what happened to those daughters. Because God put legislation in place where if there were no sons, the daughter got the birthright. The only thing she had to marry within her tribe, or they had to marry within their tribe. If there were no sons, there were no brothers. Okay, so we'll deal with that a little later. But so where are we? We stopping today. We're going to be at. We're dealing with their auction. So they're auctioned off into slavery, and the 400-year count begins at Bermuda, where we can tie the parable of the pearl, the lost son, the lost coin, the lost sheep. Yeshua said he's not sent but for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Judah was already present when he was on earth, but the northern kingdom, save for a small remnant, were not in the promised land. when Yeshua came to earth and walked the earth. Okay, so that was the whole point of the commission, to send them to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And by doing so, because they would be scattered in all nations, the gospel would reach all nations. But there was a particular nation, and that's what Genesis 15 deals with, a particular singular nation where they would be enslaved in servitude and be afflicted for 400 years. Didn't mean that the slavery had to continue for the whole 400 years, but it would be a combination of both. The affliction, even though the slavery ended, the affliction would still be going on. And you call it under different names: discrimination, racial profiling, because that's going to be one of the P's when we go to get to the prison. The coat. So the coat of many colors, the coat, fact that their coat, the African's coat, they said, they're being black, called black. Negro means black in Spanish, where you get the derogatory term from that, but it basically meant black originally. And then it became a standard term to identify people, enslaved people of color. So they got the coat of many colors on, going to slavery, into the pit. And then they're in Potiphar's house. So their slavery is going on, and you got them working the farms by and large. They worked the mines. They were enslaved to do the labor. And they contributed, just as Joseph did, to the building of Egypt. They contributed greatly to the building of the Americas, and namely the United States when it became a nation, because it continued the institution of slavery after the Revolutionary War. It was not originally a United States institution. It was a British institution, and they made an attempt to get rid of it upon becoming a nation. But because of the powerful voice in the South amongst the plantation owners, they could not use it as an issue. At the same time, they were trying to separate from Britain, because Britain was pro-slavery at the time. And so those major southern states would not have separated from Britain if slavery had been made an issue. But they did make provision to later in the Northwest Ordinance of 1780, I think it was 87. It's 87 or 89. I think it's 87. They passed a law that every colony, every territory that would come in after the 13 had to be free, could not have slaves. That got overturned later in the 1800s by the Missouri Compromise, Nebraska. There was compromise.
1787.
Yeah, so it was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So the actual founding fathers had made a provision to get around the southern states once they gotten free from Britain, and they made the provision that later got altered to say that, if you're going to make every territory free, we're going to demand that you make in the compromise for every free territory that comes in as a state, another one that comes in has to be slave.
1820 Missouri.
And that was in 1820, called the Missouri Compromise. We read about that and read about it in history, but we get often distorted views on the history, and they don't focus enough on the details of what happened. But slavery. So what we had Joseph is in Egypt in Potiphar's house, and so his descendants, Ephraim, would end up enslaved. You go back and read the curses of Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 to 68. Look at the three things that God said through Hosea, how the northern kingdom would be characterized. They would be scattered everywhere. Jezreel, the sons, the children he named, lo and me, they would have no mercy, merciless treatment, and thirdly, Ami, lo Ami, no, not my people. They would be divorced in their identity as the northern kingdom of Israel. So if you ask them, what nation did you originate from? A lot of them will end up just saying African. What nationality are you? I'm African American. That's not a nation. That's two continents, actually. maybe 4, because you got North America, Central America, and South America, plus Africa continent. That's not a nation. They would not be identified. I'm a black. I'm black. That's a color. That's not a nation. Fulfilling the prophecy concerning the divorce. Judah didn't lose their identity because they didn't get divorced. They received mercy. And we saw that last week in the first chapter of Hosea, where there would be no mercy for Israel, there would be mercy for Judah. Because Judah and Jerusalem, there were some future plans that had to do with the Messiah coming. And it had to continue to exist. Okay, so in the slave's house, what happens? Well, we've already dealt with Martin Luther King was the one that was really seeing this in his I Have a Dream speech and his last speech when he said he'd been to the mountaintop. Wouldn't get there with the people like Moses. So you deal with the two major figures that are like the bookends. That's how God revealed it to me in 2012. He said they are the bookends. Joseph, God used Joseph to bring the people into Egypt. God used Moses, to bring them out of Egypt. And in between, you have the story of what transpired. And so what we find in Joseph's 7 P's, we're at the one where he's at Potiphar's house. And while in Potiphar's house, Joseph is making contributions. He is faithful in every station he goes to, all 7 P's. He is faithful to do what he's supposed to do. He just had to deal with the pride. And so the pride is still a problem when Joseph is in Potiphar's house. And when he's with Potiphar's wife, what does he say? When she tries to get him, he tells her no, he's not going to lay with her, which is right. But he says something that he should not have said. And he said, there is no one in this house greater than I. No one greater. If there's no one greater, that is definitely saying that he's the greatest in the house. Number one, God's in the house, the one who's providing for him. He's got control of everything but Potiphar's wife. All Potiphar knows is the bread he's eating, the food he's eating at his table. Joseph is faithful, controlling it. God has blessed him grace, bunches of favor and grace. And Potiphar was aware of it. But this woman, while Potiphar's away, goes after Joseph. And this is when his pride comes out of his mouth, when he said, there's no one greater than I. God raised up in the last days one like unto Joseph that was so a major icon, a major figure, not just Martin Luther King, not just the transatlantic slave trade to show us the pit in which there was no water, but in the house, there would be one that would say he's the greatest. He's the greatest. And he's known in Israel. He's known all over the world. An athlete. His name's Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Clay. That was his phrase. Anywhere in the world, you talk about who's the greatest, people would come out of their mouth. Muhammad Ali. And there's some issues about his identity because he changed his name. But he was a marker of Joseph. He did some prison time even. Jail time, I would say, and because of that one, the fight in the war, and get caught up in that. So he was a major icon. Going into the last days, we see those same P's going on with Joseph's descendants, Ephraim. And also going on with Manasseh, too. Now, remember, Ephraim is going to be aligned primarily with the United States, but Manasseh's alignment is going to be more with Britain, okay, or its holies, its colonies. But both have to do with Britain starting off. Why? Because what happened with Solomon is that Solomon was working the 10 tribes like slaves. And when they wanted relief, when his son came to power, he wouldn't do it. He said he's going to make it worse. He's going to chastise them with serpents, with scorpions. He's going to make it worse, the yoke and the burden. And so they were taxing them. And so what you will see that Ephraim, where Ephraim is you're going to see there's going to be an issue over taxation that involves a separation from the crown. That's why we're going to have to go back and get Judah's story to understand that the crown in Britain is tied back to King David. That's why the point is the relationship between the slavery of Britain and not the rest of Europe, because it's where Judah is involved in initiating Joseph, wanting Joseph to become a slave instead of killing. And so you're going to see that involvement. Slavery beginning in the colonies was a British institution, not a U.S. Institution. The U.S. inherited when they separated, but they separated with a conscious understanding because they just went through a war to be free from Britain's abuse. The conscience of the nation said, we don't need to be continuing the institution of slavery. Benjamin Franklin got involved in the Revolutionary War. He got involved on the basis he was an abolitionist. He was against slavery, and because Britain refused to do away with it in the colonies, he wrote to them, and they responded to him that as long as you're British colonies, you're gonna have slaves, and so he got involved on that basis. It's history a lot of people don't know, but so in the house, so what happens? There's this issue about the master's wife and Joseph as a servant, begin with this woman. And he didn't, but there was trumped up charge. And his coat was used to get him in trouble. Again, his coat was an object of hatred for his brothers, colored coat. They were called colored in this nation before they were called blacks and Negroes, even though Negro was a Spanish word for black, or African American later. They were called colored. Mentioned the Methodist Church, CME, was originally called the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Now it is changed to the Christian Methodist Episcopal, but it was originally so, and that was commonly called the colored folk. Why? Because it was a prophetic fulfillment that Joseph's coat of many colors would be involved. And so keep in mind, we're talking about coat of many colors because it's not just about Joseph, it's about all the tribes of Israel scattered all over the world. They're going to be coming to the modern day Egypt, where Joseph is serving in the house, was serving in the house of bondage. And so what happens is he goes to prison because this woman, Potiphar's wife, accused him of assaulting her. This Hebrew, he said, you brought in so what's a Tamarcus. And so Potiphar is enraged and he throws him into prison. So what we saw with the slavery, we see Joseph in the house while he's still in the house, and he's in control of stuff. He's not being treated as a slave. Everything's under his control that Potiphar had, except for his wife. And he doesn't mess with his wife, but he tells her, there's no one greater than I. So that's the pride coming out of his mouth. And so what does he do? He ends up going back to the pit. Strong's number 953, bore. But it's called a dungeon. He's going to later refer to it as a dungeon, translated as a dungeon. But it's the same Hebrew word. So he didn't learn his lesson first time. He's going back to the pit, going back down. And that's where he's going to receive the gospel. Why did God, through Yeshua, command the disciples to take the gospel beginning at Jerusalem and Judea and then Samaria and then take it to what? The uttermost parts of the world? Because the gospel has to reach Ephraim. It's got to reach the house of Israel. It's got to reach the house of Joseph. Joseph got the good news in the prison, in the dungeon, in the bore, in the pit in which he was imprisoned down. And we see that with the butler, the baker, the bread, and the wine, the 3 days. One's going to be hung from a tree, the other one's going to be restored. It was using those two to show Yeshua over a 3-day period would die and be restored, be resurrected. He would have bread and wine in that same time period, at the beginning of that, the communion, we call it. The supper that Abraham had with Melchizedek in Genesis 14. So the gospel comes, and that is the turning point. That was the turning point for us, because once we got the gospel, because many of us had been converted to Islam under the Ottoman Empire on the African continent, under the Indian slave trade, which began before the transatlantic slave trade. But many were were disciples of Yeshua coming to this country, but they spoke a different language. People didn't know. Many served in prominent places because of their godly connection and the things that they did. They, even though the curses was upon them because of what we did in the land, we still benefited. Just like there was a Daniel coming out of Judah. As bad as Judah was, it had its heroes. Even in Babylon, it had Ezekiel, you got Daniel, you got the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, there's Azariah, Mishael, and the three Hebrew boys, and so forth. You got all of these guys that are prospering in Babylon because they serve God. And so you have that happening. That was our foundation in the United States. We were learning these stories. We were learning these in our churches as we grew up. I remember having to learn. We learned the Ten Commandments. We had to learn. We identified in our songs. They call them the spirituals. They call them the Negro spirituals. Talking about Moses, go down, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. We identified with them. And so our history is Joseph's history because it is his Jehovah's story. And it's repeated just as he prophesied. And so with that, we are at the prison. And I think we'll go ahead and go for one more before I stop. And that is when Joseph comes out of prison. Because we're at that point where many are still being profiled unjustly in prison for things that they did not do because of their color. Even I was reading an article right now produced by PC Magazine, online technology publication, where it was talking about people should not be just accepting these biometric scans and stuff in terms of how they identify people, because even ICE has been using that, and they said that the thing that they know about that technology is when it comes to people of color, it makes many more mistakes in identifying people of color than it does people that are not, that are Caucasian. Okay, so, and that article was saying, yeah, you should not, if you have an option, opt out to go through a manual identification and not to go through it, just because of the nature of what this does. It doesn't ask you, once it's implemented, it's one thing when they ask for your photo, because then you're involved in the process of consent and being informed. But when they start using this technology, what happens is they can use it and you not even be aware of it. And when they also find that it has made a number of mistakes when it comes to the people of color, then it's and that's a PC Magazine. I guess I remember I was reading that just this week, the article concerning that. So there's a lot of things that's going on right now. But what's important is to realize that when Joseph leaves prison after the gospel, this is the key, the turning point for those who are under the curse of Deuteronomy, God's people that were no longer his people, Lo and me. How do we get back into the marriage relationship with God, when God was married to us as a nation? Is through the gospel. That's why Yeshua had to die, to bring the lost sheep back. And by bringing the lost sheep back, he brings all of Adam's children back from all three measures of Shem, Ham, and Japheth by the gospel. So his reach is for all mankind. But he uses it through his people who were in covenant relationship from Mount Sinai, which is broken down into two basic houses. The house of Israel, Ephraim, also called the house of Joseph, and the house of Judah, called the Jews. And so when Joseph finally gets out of prison, where does he go? He's promoted to the palace. Joseph has two sons. Guess what? In the two places where they become prominent, Ephraim in the U.S., one will come to power to be the leader of the nation. But he can't be a king, but he's going to be a president. And Joseph was under Pharaoh, given charge over all of Egypt, but he could not have Pharaoh's throne. And that man was Barack Obama. Barack Hussein Obama. There was issues about his identity even when he was coming into presidency. There was issues about Joseph's identity in Egypt. His brothers thought he was an Egyptian. So you have many of the same things. And when he comes to power during a time when we're having a major housing crisis. In the very years where the 390 times 7, remember last week we talked about Leviticus and Ezekiel chapter 4, the first few verses down around verse 4 through 6, somewhere where it talks about laying on his side 390 days, a day for a year for the house of Israel, and 40 days for Judah, which was the remaining of the 70 years. 40 years remain. And that when you go to Leviticus chapter 26, God redundantly, repeatedly emphasizes 7 times, increasing the punishment, the curses 7 times until we repent. And we did not repent, so that 390 years ended up being 2,730 years. And when you go from 721 to 722, when the northern kingdom was taken away in 2 Kings chapter 17, when you go 7 times that's at the time Obama comes to power. 2008, 2009. And there was a major housing crisis. And what happened in Egypt? In Egypt, all the personal property, because of the famine, ended up becoming Pharaoh's, the government property, because he bailed them out under Joseph. Joseph bailed them out. But the cost of that was they would become slaves of Pharaoh, servants of Pharaoh, and their property would become Pharaoh, except for the priests. They didn't touch the priest's land. And Joseph was married into the priest family. His wife was the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And so he and his family ended up having high positions revered in Egypt. So they were like government employees in the priesthood, 501c3. They was exempt from tax. So you see, all of this is prophetic, exempt while they were in Goshen. Okay? So, and then they put 20% tax, and then this is what's coming prophetically. It's happening now, voluntary, but it'll become more coerced. Under Joseph's administration, they moved all the people from all of Egypt, from the country, they moved them into the city. Why? Because that's the best way to establish a Babylon. You can control the people within the city because the food, everything that they're going to require, they can't do for themselves in the city. If they're in the wilderness, out in the rural area, they can plant, fish, and hunt. And the technology doesn't have as much, it cannot scrutinize people as closely because there's still not strong signals out in the rural territories. So what we have is during the time of Obama, we have the 2,730 years. That's at 390 times 7. Just do the math. We know it was 721, 722 when the northern kingdom went into captivity under the Syrians. And so when you just subtract from 2,730, you subtract 722 or 721, and you can come up with 2008, 2009, Obama's reign as president. And now we mentioned Manasseh. Manasseh, just prior to Obama, he's the oldest son of Joseph. He's mostly associated with the British. We become a separate nation. But other nations in Africa are influenced by Great Britain. And South Africa, you have a man that's going to be in prison just like Joseph, fighting for freedom, standing for freedom, named Nelson Mandela. And what happens? His brother Manasseh ends up coming out of prison and becoming president. So he goes from prison to power. So you see that? We're tracking with Joseph 7. The leadership now. We're at the P where he goes to the palace out of prison. The key turning point is the gospel, though. The turning point is that we got to have the grace of God, and that grace is given abundantly to those who have the covenant. The new covenant, if we go back to Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, it's going to tell you that the new covenant is made with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Look in Hebrews chapter 8 and Hebrews chapter 10. It's going to repeat that same verse. It's going to quote that same verse saying that the covenant is made with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. There is no new covenant made with the Gentiles. The Gentiles must be grafted in. They have to be born again and become members of the house of Israel. Who is the spirit that is Israel? Yeshua. He is Israel, spiritually Israel. He says, Israel is my son, is Exodus 4:22. Israel is my son, my firstborn. He said, out of Egypt have I called my son. It had to be fulfilled. So Yeshua is literally Israel, spiritually, on the inside, that was made flesh. And we get to become a part of him, whether we are Jew or Gentile, from Jew or from other nations, when we get born again by the gospel. And if you read Isaiah 56, we get joined directly to the Lord by loving him and keeping his commandments. He gives us a name better than that of sons and daughters. If you read Isaiah 56, it's where Yeshua quotes when he says his house should be a house of prayer for all people, for all nations. He quotes from that chapter. It's in those 8 verses. You'll see the verse there. That he give them a name better than that of sons and daughters. He actually joins them like the priesthood, like the Levites and the priests, directly to God. And that's back in Isaiah. That was done. So anyone could become an Israelite by directly loving God and keeping his commandments, keeping his Sabbaths. He said that stranger, the eunuch. Don't say that you don't have a part with God because you're not a Jew, you're not an Israelite. Naturally. He said, if you love him and keep his commandments, he brings you in with a name better than that of sons and daughters. Okay, so we're going to stop here. We are at this point. We were going to say a little bit more about things that happened during the time of slavery, but many contributions were made just as with Joseph's time, and we are at P number 5, at the palace. At the palace where, yes, they promoted, get many government jobs, a lot of those where racial tensions were still high. You'll find it was all easier to get jobs under the federal government because you can change the laws, put laws in place that doesn't change people's hearts. So you still have a people in this country that buy into what's taught in the public school system, the theory of the lie of evolution. And they base things on color. Even in the documents that we fill out and sign, that's going to be one of the things that they are asking about. But they're still making a particular goal to separate and distinguish people based on color. Because now we're coming to a bigger type of slavery that Satan is going to implement and is implementing, and it's a world plantation. A world plantation. Okay, so this is what's coming. And everyone's going to have to be in the part of that system, or they're going to be cut out, not able to buy or sell. So we're going to get in that, and that all ties into where we are right now. So it's important that God's people start realizing who they are. He said we would remember who we were in the latter days after we've been through the blessings and the curses. That's in Deuteronomy 30. Just read verses 1 through, go down to verse 8. It'll be there in the first few verses. I think around even verse 3, 4, somewhere. But Deuteronomy chapter 30. Just go and read the first 6 or 8 verses, and you will see he's talking about when we come back to keep the covenant as it was spoken by Moses that very day in Deuteronomy 30. Okay, so we're gonna stop here.